Hello, thank you so much to Caroline and the OU History teams for the invitation to speak at this fabulous conference. We really are excited to be here, mostly because it's such a wonderful theme, and it sounds like there's going to be some super papers coming up, and it really did chime with something that Sharon and I have been working on for a while now, which is about finding feminist legal history in space. And so that's what we're going to be talking about. I'm going to be kicking off the presentation, and then Sharon will be picking up in the middle, and I'll come back towards the end. And there's something quite subversive about talking about feminism and space. So only 100 or so women have made it into space, which is about 10% of space travelers. There are 2 up there right now. To date, we've had 12 women, 12 men on the moon, but of course no women, although my boy did have a go in his ICT homework. I'm not sure whether you can hear him shouting votes for women as a woman is walking across the moon. And so we've been thinking about the relationship between legal history and space, and more specifically about constellations. And our inspiration came from the women of Greenham Common and their piece, they're saying about the only stars being in the sky. And of course, they were talking about the lack of leaders and the absence of someone being in charge being a means of thwarting people in the police and other positions of authority, and standing in contrast to the charismatic leaders of the women's organisations of the 19 and early 20th century. But Sharon and I have been wondering whether there was a bit more to it than this, because of course the women of Greenham knew that all great women and men rarely act alone. And for feminist legal scholars and historians, it's these friendships, networks and collaborations which are essential to uncovering and understanding the great lives of men and women and feminist legal history more broadly. And Sharon and I began thinking about whether we could think of these relationships and connections and interactions as feminist constellations, groups of women and men held together across time and space by a common theme, endeavour, location, and so on. So whether it's nuclear disarmament or the extension of the franchise, the use of Caxton Hall, equal pay, a feminist constellations approach is about providing a way of doing feminist legal history, building on the work of that others have gone before, but also a means through which feminist legal history might achieve its political purpose. And so, just as with the ancient Greeks, the women of Greenham Commons might turn to the constellations as a way of providing a meaning for earthly happenings. And so we might too. The stars might provide us with a way of finding alternative ways forward, of making connections and of understanding ourselves. And so before we start thinking about how we might use feminist constellations, we need to think about constellations more generally. And this is just to give a brief overview so you understand how we're using constellations. So constellations are named patterns or sets of stars that are imposed upon the night sky. And since the early 1900s, there have been an internationally agreed set of 88 constellations spanning the southern and northern hemispheres, and they're contained within officially defined boundaries. And some of these will be familiar, so whether we're talking about Cancer, the Crab, or Gemini, or Orion, and others will be less so, like the Giraffe, or the Chained Maiden, or the Herdsman. Alongside these official constellations, there are any number of unofficial constellations. And so the stars of the official constellations also appear in these unofficial constellations. And so these would be constellations like the First Slim One, or the Buffalo Embryo, the Styx, or the Wintermaker. And also then, as technology has developed and we are able to see further into space, more patterns have become visible. And so in 2018, it was reported that NASA scientists had discovered 21 new constellations, including Godzilla, the Starship Enterprise, and Schrödinger's cat. So constellations are both fixed and changing, but there's 4 characteristics that we want to draw on for our purposes today. The first is that although the stars appear near or next to each other, they're not. Many of the stars are, of course, light years away from each other. There's a difference in the temporality between the stars in the picture, and it's the picture that we're imposing that's linking the stars together. All constellations are a matter of perspective. They're simply our Earth-based interpretations of two-dimensional star patterns. The second is that within constellations, we can find asterisms. And so if you look at the Orion constellation that we have in my PowerPoint, you'll see the asterism of Orion's belt, smaller patterns of stars, which are often brighter stars and can be used sometimes to help us find or see the broader constellations. Orion's belt would be one, the Big Dipper would be another. The third point I'd like us to be thinking about is about the stars themselves. So whilst not all stars form the pattern of the constellation, so how we draw the line to draw the picture in the stars, all stars are part of one of the official 88 constellations, even those we can't see. So every star is within a constellation, even if they're not part of the formal picture. And of course, we can't see all the stars, we can't see all the stars that are there. So in the UK, for example, we're able to see about 1,400 of the stars, which is a tiny percentage of the 200 billion trillion that are in the universe. But among these stars, there are some brighter, or sometimes called supergiant stars, stars that are more visible to the naked eye, and again are often used as a means of finding other stars or finding the constellations. Some constellations have one of these brighter superstars, so Rigel would be one that Orion has. But most constellations don't have these bright stars. But all constellations have their own bright star. So there's a bright star within a constellation that helps us find a particular constellation, even if it's not one of the brightest stars in the sky. The final and fourth characteristic goes to the purpose of constellations. So one key purpose of constellations is to help people know where they are, to help them find their way to someone else. It's a purpose of navigation, of knowing where you are and where you're going to go to. So with these four features in mind, we're going to turn to the feminist constellations, which is where I hope Sharon's going to pick up from me.
Thanks, Erika. Could you put it onto the next slide? Thank you. Great. So what is a constellations approach then? Well, as Erika has already summarized, it's a methodology that enables feminist individuals, locations and groups to be connected and resituated across time and place. And its motivation is to use feminist legal history to tackle contemporary challenges in law. So it's twofold then. It's a methodology, but it's also an approach with an explicitly political purpose. So for the rest of this talk, then I'm now going to explain the methodological aspects of the approach, and then Erika is going to come back and go through what we mean by the purpose of a constellations approach. So there's three main aspects of what a feminist constellations approach encapsulates in terms of methodology, based upon what we can learn from how astronomers use constellations to map the galaxies around us, as Erika's already told us about. So first of all, the finding continuity, whereby we use a constellations approach to make continuity visible, which in turn can highlight the feminist legacies and ideas that are often considered to be new, but of course are not. Secondly, resisting temporality. So using the past to understand the present in terms of feminism and the law, while of course being mindful of different temporal contexts. And third, uncovering stars. So how we can learn about those feminists who are overlooked by, for example, mining the archives of those more prominent and celebrated feminists, the brighter stars. So in short, we are proposing this approach as a means of understanding how we write feminist legal history, as well as why. So first of all, finding continuity. Well, to look at the night sky, of course, is to look back in time, not to see constellations and stars within them as they exist now, but as they did in the past. And this provides an apt metaphor for connections between feminist groups so that they are understood not just within the time that they campaigned, but also within the bigger history of the women's movement, both then and now. And one example of this is the continuity between the Wages for Wives campaigns in the 1930s and 40s and the Wages for Housework campaigns in the 1970s all the way up until today. So at the height of second wave feminism, the International Feminist Collective began to call for the recognition of different forms of labour performed by women, including wages for housework. And a key motivation was the ability of women to exercise their rights as citizens and to access societal and political power. So to the International Feminist Collective, housework was both a crime and a life sentence. And women's lives across the world were being seen as being shaped by housework, and their lack of money and dependence upon men was because of this. As Silvia Federici, co-founder of the International Feminist Collective and Wages for Housework campaign, put it, they say it is love, we say it is unwaged work. And yet few, if any, members of the Wages for Housework campaign acknowledged or sought to explore connections with earlier groups or organisations to draw support from feminist endeavours across time. So, for example, Louise Toupin, a member of the Quebec Women's Liberation Front, writing in 2018, even went so far as to declare the Wages for Housework perspective to be a completely original school of thought and a toolbox for action at the beginning of second wave feminism. It was, of course, anything but. To suggest that the 1970s feminist movement had happened upon something entirely novel is simply incorrect. The Married Women's Association, a British group established in 1938, adopted the slogan Wages for Wives in its early years. And even by the 1930s and 1940s, arguments that economic independence was essential to women's position as citizens were already long-standing. The phrase wages for wives had been used in an argument for statutory living wage for wives in 1907, and again in newspaper report the same year, suggesting that the woman who has no money of her own and no means of earning any was a slave. It was the subtitle and subject matter of a play by Guy Bolton, which had been turned into a popular motion picture by the mid-1920s and had been argued for by Eleanor Rathbone at the National Union of Societies of Eco-Citizenship Summer School, or NUSEC, in 1928. The absence of historical roots in the International Feminist Collective's campaign is emblematic of the telescopic history adopted by much of second wave feminism. Yet drawing these connections allows us to see the transformative possibilities of feminist strategies to change the law, not just in the past, but today and beyond. As the work of Professor Prabha Kodaswaran of King's College London details, in 2021, a scheme analogous to wages for housework was promised to 30 million women in several Indian states in the form of cash transfers recognising implicitly their role in the home. This shows that the story of wages for wives or wages for housework is far from over. Next, resisting temporality. So exploring feminist networks across time contrasts with the temporality imposed upon feminist campaigners and the women's movement by historically misleading descriptions such as first wave, second wave, and the first woman. For example, Caroline Derry has observed that labelling women as firsts imposes a particular temporality upon its subject because they're frozen in an instant, the moment at which they are first to do something. And this narrative contributes to women's arrested development, obscuring and ignoring difficult histories and potential futures. So focusing upon the moment that the woman was the first to do that thing, whether it's the first to sit in Parliament, the first to represent a client in court, being awarded a university degree, all of that isolates her within that moment, neglecting what Derry refers to as the often miserable aftermath. So how can constellations help? Well, a feminist constellations approach again borrows from the astronomers, drawing connections across time. As historians, our approach, of course, and our focus is on the past, but our work can help map the future too. And a feminist constellations approach emphasizes this point. So, understandings of why and how patriarchal power is expressed through the lives and experiences of feminist relationships not only provide important context to histories of law reform, rather, these understandings can be harnessed to provide a framework for the future, to understand how things can be done differently and what could be, but what does not yet exist. One of the obvious problems with isolating feminist networks and their ideas within particular time periods is that we neglect to see the continuity within ideas, as the Wages for Wives example shows. But as well as making visible the continuity of feminist networks, a feminist constellations approach also emphasizes the untimeliness of feminist work by looking differently at the strategies used to effect change, as well as the structures constraining those efforts. Taking a long view can enable us to see how and when feminist efforts to reform the law were more likely to be successful, how, for example, legal pragmatism has been employed by feminists over time, as well as the conservative and increasingly neoliberal forces constraining feminist efforts to reform the law today. As a result, recognising these forces and embracing the untimeliness of ideas can lay bare new possibilities for overcoming the impasse feminists have faced historically when attempting to reform the law. Simply put, a feminist constellations approach makes it possible for us to see how throughout time, women have used their knowledge of feminist history to guide them in their efforts to change the future, and to understand better the material force constraining their efforts to reform the law. Now, finally, uncovering stars. So, as Erika has said, only a fraction of stars are actually within formal constellations. So when we focus on the bright stars or the stars that are joined together by a constellation or recognizable pattern, we miss looking at most of the sky. And in legal history, by focusing only on the thoroughly documented lives in law, the stories of those feminists on the fringes of these accounts are at risk of being buried. They might not have fit into our historical inquiry because they were not lawyers or were not at the forefront of campaigns, or the problem might be that the source material was simply not there. As Laurie Williamson has put it, common men and women who do not usually leave plentiful source material behind for the researcher to consult are rarely distinguished or powerful. Female life stories, like those of their male counterparts, will be about the literate, the prominent, the exceptional. And when these stories are lost, we also risk missing out on an enriched understanding of feminist work and law. E.P. Thompson's research on members of the working class shows why such accounts must be recovered. By looking at the failed campaigns and the causes that have been lost, E.P. Thompson suggests that we may discover insights into social evils which we have yet to cure. How do we do this, though? Well, one approach is well documented in Erika and Rosemary Archimedes' work, and the work of others, such as Gwen Seaborn and Janina Ramirez. It involves challenging the idea that women are unrecoverable from legal history by looking beyond legal texts, or by cross-referencing legal texts with art history, as Linda Mulcahy has done, or archaeology, as Emma Nottingham has done, or local history, as Rebecca Probert and Helen Rutherford have done. Another approach is to look again in the sky and look to what astronomers do, to use the bright stars to find other stars that might not be noticed. Aldebaran, a star I can see from my bedroom window every night, is one of the brightest stars in the sky, but its name translates as the follower, and it's used by astronomers to find a cluster of stars known as the Seven Sisters. And when applying this approach to feminist legal history, the brightest stars are often considered to be heroines or pioneers, Emmeline Pankhurst, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, or Joan of Arc. And Erika has written previously in her work with Rosemary Archimedes about the problem with this, the problem of the heroine narrative, how it can distort our narrative of history and make us overlook the collective efforts of other less prominent feminists. But inspired by constellations, Erika and I would also suggest that avoiding the heroine trap does not have to mean that we avoid researching heroines. Far from it, for writing about heroines can be an important means of learning about the lesser known feminists. Just like the astronomers who use Aldebaran to find seven sisters and other stars surrounding it, we can mine the archives of prominent feminists to learn about their connections and relationships with others. This is already, of course, an important feature of feminist legal history, and there are many examples of legal biographies that recognise the constellation of relationships in which that individual worked and lived. However, a feminist constellations approach differs a little bit in emphasis. Instead of placing an individual at the centre of the work, the starting point is the feminist constellation of which they were part. And the work of Anatha Pearson and McDowell provides an example of this in the context of Jaya Desai and the Grunwick workers' strike. So Jaya Desai, she was the instigator, coordinator and leader of the Grunwick workers' strike in 1976. She was named one of BBC Women's Hour's 7 most influential women of the last 70 years in 2016. Desai, a Gujarati woman from East Africa, became the face of a 2-year struggle that made visible not only the poor working conditions of her predominantly South Asian female colleagues working in the Grunwick film processing factory in northwest London, but also the sexist and racist discrimination that they endured. Described by one activist as the Ascot of the left, the Grunwick dispute now has iconic status in the history of the labour movement of migrant workers and labour law more broadly. But a feminist constellations approach uncovers more than Jaya Desai's story, while encouraging us to go beyond treating the Grunwick workers' strike simply as an emblematic turning point in the representation of Black and minority ethnic women workers, confined to that moment in time. Indeed, as Anatha Pearson and McDowell have uncovered through life history interviews with anonymous Grunwick strikers, looking at the woman Desai was connected to uncovers so much more than the incident of the strike itself. Instead, Desai's star illuminates a constellation of relationships that existed within the Grunwick factory, and looking more closely at these relationships can open possibilities for more holistic understandings of histories of migration, as well as the ways in which trade unions have neglected and continue to neglect the interests of minority women. So in summary, insofar as method, why might a feminist constellations approach be beneficial? Well, following a feminist constellations approach means that we actively look for connections between groups to understand the relationships between feminists differently. But it also helps us to express our motivation for being feminist legal historians too, as Erika will now explain. Erika, you're on mute.
Sorry, at least I was the first person to do it. Like, I'm very, very sorry. So, well, Sharon has been talking about how a feminist constellations approach to legal history might enable us to do better feminist legal history. The final aspect, as she's saying, is about reminding us how we might learn from the stars as to why we do feminist legal histories in the first place. I'm not sure if Rosemary's in the room, but we're answering now, Rosemary, the so what question, if you like, about the feminist constellations approach. And a while back, Rosemary Upmuty and I described feminist legal history as a call to arms for anyone who cares about the position of women in law and society in general. And we suggested it was a political project that looked to the past as a means of challenging the injustices of the present and setting agendas for the future. And this is what distinguished feminist legal history from good legal history generally, or history about women. And I think Sharon and I are repeating that challenge today because, of course, the constellations are not simply pictures in the sky. They have a purpose. They are used as a system of navigation, of knowing where you are, but also helping you know where you get to. For centuries, adventurers, colonialists, merchant sailors, traders, birds and other animals have followed the stars to navigate their way around the globe and to journey to far off places, but also to find their way back home. Now, of course, feminist constellations, unlike their official approved counterparts, are not fixed. There's no agreed or exhaustive list of feminist constellations. And nor do they have to follow the rules of official constellations. There's no requirement that each star belong to just one, or indeed any constellations. And neither must the constellations stay within their celestial boundaries. They can spill out across the sky, intersecting with each other as they're drawing the patterns. And we might begin to imagine what those patterns could be. A butterfly for the Latin American feminist movement's march against gender-based violence, or a teddy bear for the women of Green and Common, or a printing press for Caxton Hall. And so feminist constellations are inevitably changeable, they're disputable, they're partial, and their scope and shape is dependent on where you're standing, your position beneath the sky. But this doesn't mean that they can't serve a purpose of navigation. Like the mixture of animals and mythical creatures and inanimate objects that circle above our heads, they too are a means of imposing some form of orderly relationships on something that's much more complex, a means of plotting alternative ways forward and finding new purposes and anchors. In fact, feminist constellations might hold feminist legal historians to account. They're a way of reminding us to stay true to why we do feminist legal history. They're both an anchor and a guide. They provide us with a language, with arguments, with motivation for stepping up, for using feminist legal history to engage with current issues relating to social justice, feminism, and change. A feminist constellations approach to legal history is not just about how we write the histories of the past, but about how we campaign in the present. It's about taking feminist legal history into the wild and making these connections visible. So, for example, take the arguments for greater gender parity within the judiciary. The missing women judges from the senior judiciary and the proposed 50-year wait for parity lands differently for when the clock is started, whether it's when we changed our system of appointing judges back in 2006, in which case we've been only rating 20 years or so, or whether we go back to Sybil Campbell's appointment as the first salaried women's judge back in 1945, or whether we go back again to the formal entry of women to the legal profession in 1919, or back to the Tudor period, where there's evidence suggesting that women sat at judges in the county courts, or even back to 1361 to the Justices of the Peace Act, which allowed women to serve as unpaid magistrates. But this isn't just about adding a kind of feminist, a legal history angle to contemporary discussions, akin to the history chapter at the beginning of a textbook. It's not simply a slightly more sophisticated version of saying, we've been here before. It's about using us as feminist legal historians and remembering why we do feminist legal history. It's reminding us about who we talk to, what we're looking to uncover. It's helping us design and think about which projects we undertake. A feminist constellations approach draws patterns of feminist legal history across time. It's a way of resisting temporalities. It's a way of making continuities and connections visible. It's a way of following the lights of brighter stars and using their rich archives of information to find other unconnected yet neglected figures and networks. But it's also about placing contemporary feminist projects at the heart of legal history. And in so doing, it requires us to take seriously our own political commitment as feminist legal scholars and our roles as scholars, both inside and outside law, reform, and campaigns. Because after all, the more we understand how people have experienced and used and pushed back against the law, the more we may be able to affect feminist engagement with law in the future. And the more likely we are to make our own stars visible alongside those of every woman, man, girl, and boy in their own feminist constellations of law.